Welcome to another episode of the Covenant Podcast. The Covenant Podcast exists to equip listeners with theological content from a 1689 Baptist perspective. We're on the Man of God Network, brought to you by Covenant Baptist Theological Seminary, and the title of this episode is Biblical Languages and Ministry. The content of this episode was originally a live conversation on Twitter Spaces. The conversation was between pastors J. Ryan Davidson, Timothy Decker, and Josh Wilson. Pastor Ryan is a professor of practical theology at Covenant Baptist Theological Seminary. Pastor Decker teaches elementary Greek 1 and elementary Greek 2, and Pastor Wilson teaches Hebrew 1 and Hebrew 2. So it was a unique opportunity to get to have three of the CBTS professors together in one conversation to talk about the usefulness in Christian ministry of the biblical languages. It was our first time having a conversation on Twitter Spaces, and we learned a lot. One of the things that happened in this conversation was that I was unable to hear Dr. Decker's voice the entire recording. I could only hear Pastor Ryan and Pastor Josh Wilson talk to me and tell me whenever Pastor Decker was talking. But we found the conversation to be so useful in its content that we're releasing it here as well on the Covenant Podcast. So if there is a little bit of awkwardness, if there is a little bit of weird pauses, please bear with them and be benefited by the answers that the pastors give to the various questions in this recording. So without any further introduction, I hope this conversation is useful to you as you consider biblical languages and ministry. But just to kick off this conversation until they can begin speaking and figure out the feature for themselves, I'll start with you, Pastor Ryan. We're really excited for how the Lord is using you at CBTS, and you are teaching many of the courses for our newest degree program. And for that program, we require that Greek be taken. So what are your thoughts about this, brother? Why do you think it could be helpful to study Greek in relation to understanding how to counsel the people of God? And in what ways does an understanding of the original language shape the areas that you personally teach for the seminary?
No, that's a great question, brother. I think in short, it's by design that the Master of Arts in Theological Studies, with an emphasis in counseling, has a requirement of at least 2 Greek courses. And I think the reason for that is that when we consider ministry, even the ministry of counseling, it's important to say 2 things. Firstly, that the word of Christ is our foundation for that. And then secondly, but related to that, is the idea that to rightly utilize the word, it's worth a study of the languages in which that word was originally given. And it also helps us to remember that as students of the word, knowing those original languages, in this case Greek, is particularly helpful when we think about how to encourage people to look to the word and put passages of scripture together in the counseling room. And so while I would encourage biblical counselor to be diving into the biblical languages in the midst of a counseling session, I do think it's important. It's an important statement that is made that the languages are important for our overarching education as we learn to study the word.
Yeah, and I think that's wise that you said that we shouldn't necessarily dig into the biblical languages in the counseling room, but for you, in your specific area of study, Pastor Ryan, and your specific area of teaching, what have you had to study in the original languages in your degree programs as you were receiving training? And how have you been benefited by that, brother?
Well, I'll be interested to see if our other brothers have thoughts. I mean, for me, the biblical languages are a lifetime study. I don't like I will ever finish in this lifetime to learn about Greek and Hebrew. I mean, in my seminary training, I took both languages. In my doctoral work, I've utilized Greek, or had connection to Greek more than Hebrew, just given that it's kind of related to early church kinds of things. But I would say my predominant work in the languages has been just weekly preparation for sermons, even beyond counseling. And I think it's been very helpful for me to consider getting into the grammar and syntax of the New Testament writers and seeing how they have utilized, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, that language to convey the word of Christ. I mean, there's more that I could say, but in short, it's been crucial in many respects for me.
Dr. Decker, I'm going to have some specific questions for you, but if you were able to hear Pastor Ryan's comments, do you have anything to follow up with there?
Yeah, I don't know. I think I was still trying to catch everything, on my phone to get it to work. So I'm not sure I heard all that Ryan had to say. So I don't know that I should fill in anything right now.
But I'll begin with my questions now that I had for Dr. Decker. And though I won't be able to know when he's done talking, maybe somebody else can indicate that to me. Dr. Decker, as you know, maybe our listeners don't, you are one of our Greek professors at CBTS. Professor Amati is also one of our Greek professors at CBTS, and he was unable to join us today because of some scheduling things that he had. He's actually a number of hours ahead of us here in the United States. He has a Wednesday night Bible study happening about right now. But you are one of the professors at CBTS for Greek, and so I want to ask you just a shotgun of questions here. One of them is obviously, why study biblical Greek? And in just a moment, I'm going to ask the same question to Pastor Wilson, why study biblical Hebrew? But I'm curious to know, in what ways does studying Greek differ from studying Hebrew? And to learn and maintain Hebrew and Greek at the same time, since CBTS requires that you study both of these languages for the degree program. So what are your thoughts about this?
Well, there's so much there to ask. Let's see here. Which one do you want me to start with? Why study Greek, or?
Yeah, Dr. Decker, I don't think Austin can hear you, but we can. So I would say maybe, start with that one. Why study Greek, and then maybe the differences between Greek and Hebrew.
Okay. Well, to study Greek is because that's the language that the New Testament was written in. And I've likened this before to our English translations. Many of our modern translations are wonderful translations. They're very accurate and effective, but you're still reading it in a different language. And so that would be similar to watching television, or maybe liken it to watching old VHS. Those of you who remember what those are, very grainy, and the picture is not as clear. But then when you upgrade from not even DVD to Blu-ray, things become crystal clear. So you would learn Greek because it clarifies many things. But I also have to warn students that learning the languages like Greek or Hebrew is not a silver bullet. It's not as if all your answers are found within the language. That can also be a mischaracterization of learning the language. You also need to realize that a great deal of context, of theology is part of the process. And so it's not just a silver bullet to solve all the problems, but it does help you visualize. It helps you to see more clearly what is going on, to see grammatical, syntactical thrust, things that are being emphasized in the language that you would not normally see in English or other languages. So the simple answer is you want to learn it because that's the language that it was written in. And as we have said many times, to the sources ad fontes. And so we'd want to go back to the source to know as accurately as possible what was actually written. As far as learning Greek over Hebrew or Hebrew over Greek, or I'm not sure which was the question that was kind of phasing out on my end as well. So I don't know if Austin or Ryan or even Dr. Wilson could answer this as well. If you want to rephrase the question for me.
I think the question, brother, was maybe some of the differences in not so much the two languages, but in learning the two languages.
The next question for Dr. Decker was, in what ways does studying Greek differ from studying Hebrew?
Yeah, so I think because familiarity with Romantic languages, many people have taken Spanish, Latin, Italian, some kind of Romantic language that familiarizes a student with Greek already, whereas those students who have not had any kind of language background, they tend to find that Hebrew is a little bit easier. There's more consistency. They understand the patterns a bit easier. And so I've seen that, although I think 90% of the time I've come across people that said learning Greek was easier, but it's usually because they've had familiarity with Romantic languages. One of the things that people get afraid of when they come across Hebrew is that the characters are different. You read it right to left, and they think that their brains will not adapt, forgetting who it was that created both language and their brains, that God has created our brains to do this. And so those of you students who have taken Greek, taken Hebrew and other languages, you realize your brain adapts. God has made your brain to not even really see the letters as characters anymore, but just to see the language as it is. And so I think if we trusted our Creator to facilitate what he has created us to be able to do in terms of language, then we would have a lot less fear and trepidation.
Tim, Dr. Decker, the last question that Austin wanted to ask you at this juncture is, do you have any advice for trying to maintain both of the languages?
Both the languages. Well, it's like riding a bike. If you don't use it, you will lose it. And if you find yourself more proficient in one language over the other, then certainly you would want to stay in those languages, stay in the text. Right now, I have the opportunity to be preaching through the Old Testament, and so I'm constantly in my Hebrew, just staying in the text that way. And so for my private worship, I'm reading my Greek. And so when that time will come where I preach the New Testament, I'll switch in for my private worship and read through Hebrew. However, this isn't to say that your private worship should solely be given over to original languages, because you still want to be able to hear God in your native tongue, and that is an important feature. But the easiest way to keep up with your language skills is to use it every day. Some students, it's just a matter of translating one verse a day just to keep you at it, and others can do more than that. They can become more proficient in reading the text. They can watch videos. There's online videos, Daily Dose of Greek, Daily Dose of Hebrew, Daily Dose of Aramaic is coming out soon. And so there are ways to keep you interacting with the text, but the best thing you can do is do it yourself. Get into the text, translate it, read it, and keep using it for your sermon preparation. And that's the main thing, using it for your sermon preparation. I can't tell you how many times I've come across students, not my students necessarily, but just pastors in general, that they took Greek or they took Hebrew because they had to for their program, and they actually admitted to me that they never use it. I was struck by that. May it not be said of students from CBTS that you learn these languages only because you had to, not that you need it. It's a vital part of sermon preparation to see the text outline itself, to catch word plays and syntactical strategies that the author is using. Nothing else, it makes sermon prep a lot faster too. I don't have to read nearly as many commentaries because I'm in the text and I'm seeing exactly what they're going to tell me anyhow. So it speeds up sermon preparation a great deal.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Dr. Decker, for your answers to some of our questions. We do want to get Dr. Wilson in on the conversation. We're making some pretty good time here, and our goal of having a 20 to 25-minute conversation. But Dr. Wilson, since Hebrew was given to us first in the historical order of special revelation, I'm curious to know, in your estimation, which of the biblical languages people should begin studying first, Hebrew or Greek. I'm curious to know whether you think Hebrew or Greek is more difficult, and if that plays a role in which of the languages should be studied first. And what do you enjoy about Hebrew? You're our Hebrew professor. Why do you think Hebrew can be beneficial for ministry? So hopefully I can hear you. So if you need to have the questions read to you again, I can do that for you.
No, well, yeah, I may need them read again because I'm sure I'll forget one of those questions as I answer them. But I was going to say that Daily Dose of Aramaic is actually out, and there's also Daily Dose of Latin as well for people who are wanting to go that route. But I would, in teaching students, I would say that one of the great deficiencies that several students bring to language studies is English grammar. And I was one of those students when I took Greek in college. I didn't even know what a direct object was. And Greek really helped me to improve my English grammar. And so as that improved, my Greek improved. And so that being said, Greek is much better for getting better at English grammar and improving in Greek grammar than Hebrew is. So I would recommend for any student to take Greek first, especially if they have a deficiency in English grammar, because you don't want to be trying to get better at English grammar in Hebrew. It's going to be very difficult. But Greek and Latin have been used in pedagogy for teaching English grammar for centuries. So that would be my recommendation as far as what to take first. But, something Dr. Decker had said is, everybody's brains are unique to them. And so there are some people that can just, they can just have a quick grasp of language. And they could do Hebrew first, but it's not common that I've noticed when I've been teaching the languages. As far as for pastoral ministry, I think one of the greatest benefits of knowing the language is to be able to protect the flock. And what I mean by that is, the world is filled with false teachers. And I remember one time when I had just become a follower of Jesus, going with a friend because his sister had been talking with Jehovah's Witnesses. And I remember going to that meeting to kind of meet with her and meet with them to help her from being ensnared by these Jehovah's Witnesses. And they pulled out the Greek, which I didn't know at the time. And I just kind of felt like maybe they're right. I don't know anything about Greek, but they seem to, and their arguments seem to be sound. And this is a technique that false teachers use all the time, taking their limited knowledge of Greek or Hebrew and using that to try to persuade people of their heresies. And I think it's important for a shepherd of the flock to have a good grasp of the biblical languages so that whenever any of his congregation comes into contact with these false teachers, and we even have one in our area that posts to Facebook and will try to convince people using a limited knowledge of Hebrew or Greek of his heretical positions. If they come to you, then you, having been trained in the languages, are able to protect them from those false teachings. It would be very bad if they came to you and asked, how should I respond to this person? and their statements about Greek and Hebrew, and you just say, well, I don't know Greek or Hebrew. So I can't remember the other questions, Austin, so you may have to refresh my memory.
Yeah. I think you answered most of them, but one of the questions that maybe you sufficiently answered it, or maybe you want to say more to it that I'm curious to hear you answer is, in your estimation, which of the languages is harder to understand? You kind of said that you think that Greek should be studied first because many people don't have an understanding of English grammar. So this may be my follow-up question to you. Do you think that means that Hebrew is harder to acquire for English speakers? Or if you were to assess both of the languages, which one do you think is more difficult to learn and why?
Yeah, that's a good question. Honestly, from my own personal experience, I would say Hebrew is harder to learn. So I took Greek in college, and even though I was very deficient in English grammar, I was able to pick it up very quickly. And then the same in seminary, I was able to run with it. I took, after having, I think, 2 years of Greek in college and understanding it very well, I had 1 year of Hebrew in college, and that's all they offered where I went at Missouri Baptist University. And I still, after that 1 year, just had a really difficult time understanding Hebrew. And it wasn't until I went to seminary, had a very good professor who had a very helpful grammar that I was able to finally get a good grasp of Hebrew.
Well, I'll give Pastor Ryan and Pastor Decker an opportunity now to respond to your comments there before I ask my last wrapping up question. So do you brothers have any follow-up to what Dr. Wilson has been saying?
I'd like to ask Dr. Wilson, I don't know if you get this question a lot. I get is if you only got to choose one language, one biblical language to study, which one should it be? I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, and then I'll share mine after.
Well, wow. I think I could say, well, here's one thought, is that Hebrew for sure, because 3/4 of the Bible is written in Hebrew. But at the same time, if you study Greek, it gives you a leg up on understanding the Septuagint, but that's still a translation of the Hebrew. But if you could only choose one, who would ever be limited in that position? Maybe financially, I'm not sure, but I would say Hebrew just because you have more of the Bible written in Hebrew.
I usually agree and tell people the same thing. And I tell them, look, I teach Greek, but if you only had one language to learn, you need to learn Hebrew. I think there's more exegetical pay dirt to be had in Hebrew than there is in Greek. You know how people study the language looking for some kind of sermonic nugget that they can share. Well, if there are those sermonic nuggets, you're going to find them more so in Hebrew, I have found. But as you said, 3/4, I might even go so far as to say 4/5 of your Bible is Hebrew. And so it would serve you much better to if you only had one to make it that one. So I'm glad we're in agreement.
I would just add, to the conversation only that, we talked at the beginning about how in the counseling program we have one particular language. In our case, it's Greek, but whichever language it is, one of the benefits for someone training for counseling and the using of the scriptures in counseling ministry, one of the benefits of studying language is that studying languages makes you slow down with the text. And it's helpful as a person begins to study and to slow down with the text, particularly when sometimes in counseling sessions, you may be dealing with a verse or two. I think studying the languages helps to increase your knowledge of how texts fit together in larger contexts. So, some may say, why in the world are we doing 2 semesters of a biblical language and a counseling program, but I think that that's part of the benefit at our CBTS counseling program.
Yeah, thank you guys for that. I want to wrap us up by giving you all an opportunity to answer a question, which I think wraps us up well, because it's kind of where Pastor Ryan began us. And he said in the beginning of this conversation that he really views the study of the languages as a lifelong pursuit, or something to that effect. And many of our students at CBTS will come and they'll be under the intensive study of Greek and Hebrew, and they'll sit under a few lectures of biblical Aramaic. And maybe when they graduate, it can be tempting to stop intensively studying the language and gradually lose the languages. Professor Amati gave us some statistics with Greek and Hebrew about the vast majority of seminary graduates who quickly lose their Greek and Hebrew and either never take it up again or aren't as efficient in understanding the language as they once were. So my final question to the three of you are, do you have any practical tips or practical pieces of advice to continue in the pursuit of studying the languages for the rest of our lives so we don't lose our facility in the biblical languages?
Austin, I'll just go real fast. These other 2 brothers probably will have more helpful information than I will. I mean, I will just say that, I think carving out time to practice, to look at it, currently, and I can't say that I've done this for, decades, but currently in the mornings, I try to translate in the New Testament, a verse or 2 through a book of scripture. That's kind of what I'm doing as a part of my routine. I think I have a stronger facility in Greek than I currently do in Hebrew, so I'm trying to study again over this year the language. So I think just using it, getting into it is helpful.
Yeah, I'll just echo that. It's a tool that you have to use every day. Like Dr. Decker had said before, if you don't use it, you lose it. So what I do is I have a to-do list, an everyday to-do list, and I alternate each day between trying to read a chapter in Hebrew and trying to read a chapter in Greek. And so that's how I try to stay proficient with it. I think what can also be helpful to not only stay proficient in the biblical languages, but to get proficient in the biblical languages is to use some of these online resources where they are trying to get you to learn the biblical language in a I can't think of the term, but it's where you're practicing just speaking it.
Living language approach.
Yeah, the living language approach. So like I think Biblingo does this. There's a YouTube channel called Olive with Bet. I think there's a Greek one as well that's similar to Olive with Bet. But just watching those and those, they're like 10-minute videos, watching those every day, like as you listen to the language being spoken and then you start to read it, you'll get more proficient at reading the language rather than translating it in your head as you're reading it. And I think that helps increase proficiency.
I don't know if Austin can hear me, but I'll jump in real fast too. One thing that I've found very helpful when I am reading, like I mentioned in private worship, and I think Dr. Wilson was saying something similar, is finding a good reader's Greek New Testament or reader's Hebrew Old Testament. These are original language Bibles, but they give words that are not used so many times. You can only learn so much vocabulary in Greek 1 through 4 and Hebrew 1 through 4. And so words that are used, 20 times or less are given to you at the bottom. So when you come across them, you are able to, without having to crack your own lexicon, it's just right there for you. It makes reading a lot easier. The Tyndale House Greek New Testament came out with one I thought is probably the best reader's Greek New Testament out there, especially because it goes through a lot of irregular forms. A lot of students they hate what's called the second aorist and all the irregularities that Greek can have, and I just tell them to look at all the irregularities of English and then come talk to me. But it gives you a lot of those helps along with words that are used, 20, 25 times or less. And it's been a wonderful way to make sure that you can read quickly through the original languages. I don't know if there's anything quite like that for the Hebrew Old Testament. I know they have Reader's Hebrew Old Testament, but I don't know if it's done by the same publisher or not. But I would say if you're going to invest money into something like that, you will want two different kinds of original language Bibles. You'll want the standard academic one, whether it be the Nestle Allen Greek New Testament or the BHS for your Hebrew Old Testament. But I would also say invest in a good Reader's Old Testament and a Reader's Greek New Testament. And I think Zondervan put one that has both Hebrew and Greek together in one fairly large volume that you can take with you, or you can have it for your morning worship. The last thing I'll say about how do you keep up your language? Well, you need to keep your biblical languages, especially you guys who are in seminary. And even if you've gotten out of seminary and you're pastoring now, I want you to think of your training as a precious tool, a power tool, even something that you spent a long time sharpening. Why would you let it get rusty? Why would you let it get dull? You'd want to keep it sharp so you could continually use it. I think it was Abraham Lincoln who said if he had 4 hours to chop down a tree, he would spend 3 hours of them sharpening his axe. Well, you've spent how many years in seminary sharpening that axe? Why would you then have a wonderfully sharp, razor sharp axe and then let it dull? Well, you wouldn't want to do that. And so likewise, we would also want to encourage you to consider the retaining of a biblical language as something you'd want to keep sharp. And it's too precious to let go. So don't give up on it.
Well, I want to thank all of you for joining us in our first ever Twitter Spaces conversation, and special thanks to Pastors Ryan, Timothy, and Josh for joining us to talk about the biblical languages and ministry. Covenant Baptist Theological Seminary has a vision to help the church to prepare men to undertake the full range of pastoral responsibilities that they will face in serving Christ and his kingdom, and to equip Christians for effective service in the church. And we really hope that this conversation about the biblical languages and ministry have helped accomplish our mission in a small way. Thank you all for joining us in this conversation, and we'll be posting it soon, Lord willing. Grace and peace to you. God bless.